All right, Biblical DNA here. Today's video, The Mystery of the Cross, a historical perspective on crucifixion. Let's go ahead and get this presentation started. Historical origins and development. Assyrians and Babylonians, crucifixion traces back to the Assyrians who used impalement as a form of punishment and terror. This practice was a precursor to crucifixion. Persians. The Persian Empire employed crucifixion to punish rebels and traitors as early as the 6th century BCE. For instance, Herodotus recorded the crucifixion of opponents by Darius I. Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. Alexander the Great introduced crucifixion to the eastern Mediterranean after witnessing its use during his conquest. Phoenicians and Carthaginians. The Phoenicians, who were influential in Mediterranean trade and culture, brought crucifixion to Rome during the 3rd century BCE. The Carthaginians further developed its use, particularly for punishing deserters and enemies. The Romans refined crucifixion into a method of execution in psychological warfare. They used it to punish slaves, rebels, and criminals. And then on the next slide, I have the notables. Abolishment. Emperor Constantine the Great abolished crucifixion in the Roman Empire in the early 4th century CE as a gesture of respect for Yeshua HaMashiach. Also, in preparation, victims were scourged to weaken them and prolong their suffering on the cross, carrying the crossbeam. The condemned would carry the patibulum crossbeam to the execution site. Execution victims were nailed or tied to the cross in various positions to maximize suffering and public humiliation. All right, these are the famous crucifixions. So Spartacus tops the list, a gladiator and leader of a slave revolt against Rome in 73 to 71 BCE. Spartacus was crucified along with 6,000 of his followers. And for those that don't know who Spartacus is the famous Thracian who rebelled against the Roman Empire and fought to free all slaves from their slave owners or their imprisonment, and to be able to die a free man. That was the whole goal, for everyone to be able to die a free man, for the people, for no slaves, that every man deserves to be free. That's what Spartacus stood for. Yeshua, the famous person to be crucified, Yeshua was crucified by the Romans around 30 CE. His crucifixion is recorded in the New Testament Gospels and is celebrated by Christians on Good Friday. Yeah, I don't know. Saint Peter, one of Yeshua's 12 apostles, Saint Peter was crucified upside down at his own request around 64 CE. Saint Andrew, Saint Peter's brother, Saint Andrew was crucified on an egg-shaped cross. Simeon of Jerusalem, the second bishop of Jerusalem, Simeon, was crucified in 106 or 107 CE. Many, the founder of Manichaeism, Many was depicted by followers as having died by crucifixion in 274 CE. Crucifixion was a popular form of punishment in the Roman-occupied Holy Land. Emperor Constantine first abolished crucifixion in the Roman Empire in 337 CE. Now, the reason why I don't agree with celebrating crucifixion is because what people died for, because what they died for by crucifixion. So a lot of them died for rebellion as slaves, as Spartacus, and that continued. Some people died because they didn't want to conform with Rome, with the Romans. A lot of Thracians died because of that. because they would rather seek death than fall at the hand of Romans. Now, obviously, not everybody saw it that way because they saw what crucifixion was like. And so they were thinking to themselves, I got a wife, I got children. I'm not going to end it here. I'm going to become a Roman and follow the ways of the Romans. Now, is that what Yeshua did? Is that why Christians carry their crosses? I don't know. It's, to me, I don't care about the cross personally, not religiously, not emotionally, not theoretic. I don't know. I don't believe the cross is anything good because the way it was used to kill so many people. It wasn't just Yeshua. He was just the famous one. He's not even the first one. He was just the famous character to be done. To be, if it was a historical death, he was the most famous one historically to die on the cross. The crucifixion of Yeshua. Central to Christian theology, the crucifixion of Yeshua symbolizes redemption and atonement for humanity's sins. Yeshua was crucified at Golgotha after being scourged and forced to carry his cross. Symbolism of the cross. For Christians, the cross is a powerful symbol of hope, salvation, and self-sacrifice. The Apostle Paul frequently referenced the cross in his letters, emphasizing its role in salvation, e.g., 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 18. Early Christian adoption, the cross evolved from an instrument of death to a revered symbol. Early Christians used it to secretly in art and worship to identify themselves during times of persecution. That's the biblical usage and significance. All right, and like I said, to me personally, the cross represents death. It represented death in the old world. It represented death in the new world. Just leave it at that. The history and pathology of crucifixion. F.P. Rutledge, L. Sillars. In antiquity, crucifixion was considered one of the most brutal and shameful modes of death, probably originating with the Assyrians and Babylonians. It was used systematically by the Persians in the 6th century BC. Alexander the Great brought it from there to the eastern Mediterranean countries in the 4th century BC, and the Phoenicians introduced it to Rome in the 3rd century BC. It was virtually never used in pre-Hellenic Greece. The Romans perfected crucifixion for 500 years until it was abolished by Constantine I in the 4th century AD. Crucifixion in Roman times was applied mostly to slaves, disgraced soldiers, Christians, and foreigners, only very rarely to Roman citizens. Death, usually after 6 hours, 4 days, was due to multifactorial pathology, after effects of compulsory scourging and maiming, hemorrhage, and dehydration, causing hypovolemic shock and pain. But the most important factor was progressive asphyxia, caused by impairment of respiratory movement, resultant anoxemia, exaggerated hypovolemic shock. Death was probably commonly precipitated by cardiac arrest caused by vasovagal reflexes, initiated inter alia by severe anoxemia, severe pain, body blows, and beating or breaking of the large bones. The attending Roman guards could only leave the site after the victim had died and were known to precipitate death by means of deliberate fracturing of the tibia and or fibula, spear stab wounds into the heart, sharp blows to the front of the chest, or a smoking fire built at the foot of the cross to asphyxiate the victim. The three most brutal forms of execution known to antiquity were judged to be crux, crucifixion, cremation, burning, desilato, decapitation, in that order. Originating in Mesopotamia and Persia, crucifixion was perfected by the Romans, who saw it as a most shameful mode of death, with Cicero once exclaiming that it was inappropriate for a Roman even to be confronted with the word cross. The history of this procedure over almost 1,000 years until it was abolished in the 4th century AD is reviewed, with emphasis on medical aspects of death by crucifixion. History. Crucifixion may be defined as a method of execution by which a person is hanged, usually by his arms, from a cross or similar structure until he dies. This must be differentiated from an ancient Jewish custom whereby a condemned person was first executed, e.g., by stoning, and then hung from a post, tree, or other structure. Probably originating with the Assyrians and Babylonians, crucifixion was first used systematically by the Persians. In its earliest form in Persia, the victim was tied to a tree or post, or even impaled on an upright post with feet clear of the ground. Only later was a cross used. In the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great adopted crucifixion and brought it to the Mediterranean shores, where his successors introduced it inter alia to Egypt, Syria, Phoenicia, and Carthage. During the Punic Wars, the Romans learned the technique and proceeded to become the principal utilizers of crucifixion for more than 5 centuries. Crucifixion was virtually never used in pre-Hellenic Greece, although it was mentioned in non-historical literature. However, wherever the Roman legions went, crucifixion was practiced. And according to historians, local tribes retaliated in kind. In AD 9, the victorious Germanic leader Arminius crucified many of the Roman general various defeated soldiers. And in AD 28, Germanic tribesmen crucified Roman tax collectors. During Abaldicia's revolt in Britain, AD 59 to 61, many legionnaires were crucified. Little information exists about the extent of crucifixion practiced in Spain, Gaul, North Africa, the Danube Valley, and Asia Minor. Although it is commonly accepted that crucifixion did not play a role in early Judaic law, Fitzmyer makes a case for possible Pentateuchal origins. The Quran or Qumran parchments certainly approved of it, and we do have evidence of Jewish crucifixions after the 2nd century BC. At the time of Christ, Jewish law therefore accepted crucifixion in addition to older methods of execution like stoning and strangling, considering it a particularly shameful way of dying and a curse from God. Deuteronomy 28:23. Under Roman occupation, crucifixion became commonplace in Palestine. Varus crucifying 2,000 Jews in 4 BC, and Josephus reporting on mass crucifixions during the Jewish War. Crucifixion was finally abolished by Constantine first after AD 320. Roman indications for crucifixion. Although Roman citizenship brought a measure of protection against execution by crucifixion, this protection was not absolute. Absolute. The republican axiom of equality of all in terms of Roman law became eroded during the early empire. The new concept of hominidis, upper classes, and humiliaris, lower classes, developed, with the former very rarely crucified. Crucifixion was generally seen as slave punishment, but other groups such as Christians, foreigners, and liberated slaves, liberty, were also numerous. Whether or not they had acquired Roman citizenship and had been promoted to equestrian rank, Kuhn showed that although a rare event, Roman citizens were crucified from time to time. During the first century, Palestine saw the crucifixion of large numbers of rebels against Rome, mostly Jews. Christ was crucified on the pretext that he instigated rebellion against Rome on a par with zealots and other political activists. Khan makes the point that although many victims condemned to crucifixion were called robbers, the majority were probably politically motivated individuals rather than true criminals. He furthermore states that in Palestine, the Romans were primarily interested in subjugating political dissent, not ordinary criminality. Crucifixion procedure. The cross. In Persian times, crucifixion was originally performed on trees or simple pole structures rather than a formal cross. The Romans still crucified on trees in flex lignum or post crux simplex from time to time, but now a variety of crosses came into regular use, viz. An X-shaped cross, crus decutia, but in the majority of cases the well-known Latin cross, crux imisia, or tau crus, crus comitia, were used. These crosses could be tall crux sublimis, but were more commonly low crux humilius, and consisted of an upright post, stitch, and crossbar patibulum. The commonly used low cross was 1.8 to 2.4 meters tall, and the patibulum 1.5 to 1.8 meters long, and it weighed well over 130 kilograms, with the patibulum alone weighing up to 57 kilograms. The steps was usually implanted ahead of the crucifixion event, and the patibulum attached after the victim had been nailed or tied to it. The inscription titulus was nailed to the steps above the victim, sometimes a wooden support for the buttocks. Sedelicus was, or sedelica, was attached to the steps, and rather rarely a footrest, supodemium, primarily procedures or preliminary procedures. In Roman law, a person condemned to death, including crucifixion, had to be scourged beforehand, with the exception of women, Roman senators, or soldiers, but not in cases of desertion. Scourging was a particularly brutal procedure performed with wooden staves or a short whip, flagrum, with several leather thongs into which small balls or sharp sheep bone fragments were tied. The person was stripped naked, tied to an upright post, and then flogged across the back, buttocks, and legs by one or two soldiers, victors. Primrose suggests that scourging was applied to the front of the body as well. In Roman law, there was no limit to the extent of flogging, but in Jewish law it was limited to 40 blows. The extent of the scourging, therefore, depended largely on the inclination of the lictors, was intended to weaken the victim significantly and invariably resulted in deep wounding, severe pain, and bleeding. Frequently, the victim fainted during the procedure, and sudden death was not uncommon. The victim was then usually taunted, then forced to carry the pantaloon tied across his shoulders to the place of execution. In addition to scourging, and the condemned could also be maimed, e.g., by excision of the tongue or other bodily parts, or blinding of the eyes. Josephus reports a particularly cruel procedure used by Antiochus IV, whereby the victim's strangled child was hung around his neck. A set of Roman guards, commanded by a centurion, com- accompanied the condemned to the place of execution and stayed on duty until the victim had died. A herald walked ahead with the titulus, and on the way bystanders derided and taunted the condemned. The crucifixion process. In Jerusalem, according to custom, women offered the victim an analgesic drink consisting of wine and myrrh or incense. If not already naked, he was then stripped and made to lie on his back with his arms extended along the patibulum. The arms were tied to the beam or fixed by means of iron nails driven through the wrist, rather than the hands, which sometimes could not carry the body weight without tearing loose. There is also evidence that these square nails, 13 to 18 centimeters long, 1 centimeter thick, were occasionally driven through the upper forearms. On occasion, the victim was crucified upside down. The pantaloon and victim were now lifted and fixed onto the steps, and the feet tied or nailed to the upright post. This could happen in a variety of ways. Either the feet were nailed to the sides of the steps or atop each other to the front of the step. In the later case, a single nail was usually driven through the metatarsal bones of both feet, with the soles nearly horizontal to the step's surface and the knees flicked. Archaeological evidence shows that the feet were sometimes encased in a small wooden box-like structure before being nailed to the post. In that case, the flexed knees and feet were swung laterally and nail driven through the superimposed calanchi tailbones. The titulus was then affixed. Mm. The soldiers divided the victims' clothes among themselves and awaited death, which on average would take from 3 to 4 hours to 3 to 4 days. If there was reason to expedite death or to ensure that the death had it set in, the legs, one or both, were broken beneath the knees, crura fragrum, with a blunt implement. Although axes and even toothed metal implements were sometimes used, death could also be ensured by way of a club blow to the sternal region or a spear stab to the heart through the upper abdomen or chest. Occasionally, a smoking fire was lit at the foot of the cross to smother the victim. After death, Roman law allowed the family of the deceased to remove the body for burial after obtaining permission from a judge. Otherwise, it was customary to leave the corpse on the cross to be devoured by predatory animals and birds. Man. Causes of death. Victims died of multifactorial pathology. Primarily, preliminaries to crucifixion. Preliminaries to crucifixion, like scourging and maiming, caused the condemned to arrive at the cross severely traumatized. In addition to psychological shock and severe pain, blood and serum oozing from deep wounds caused by the flagellum caused of a degree of hypovolemic shock. Sudden death during scourging probably resulted from reflex vasovagal cardiac arrest. Conditions known to precipitate vasovagal cardiac arrest include any very acute pain, pressure on the neck, a blunt blow to the chest, abdomen, groin, or neck, puncture of the pleura, sudden dilation of a hollow organ like the gut or cervix, sudden inflow of cold water into the nasopharynx or down the trachea, and acute anoxemia. Many victims probably had little to eat or drink in the period preceding crucifixion, and abstinence on the cross must have caused progressive dehydration, aggravating hypothermia from other causes. During crucifixion, severe continuous pain would have arisen inter alia from the nailing procedure, the scourge back rubbing against the rough cross, also aggravating bleeding and cramps in the arms, shoulders, and to a lesser extent the legs. A large nail driven through the wrist would probably have parted rather than fractured the carpal bones, but could certainly have injured the median nerve with resultant pain. Similar nerve pain could have arisen from damage to the peroneal and plantar nerves in the feet. Death by crucifixion was indeed excruciating, excruciates out of the cross in every sense of the word. Main cause of death. The main cause of death in the majority of victims would have been asphyxiation from severely hampered respiration with secondary cardiovascular collapse. Hanging from the arms made expiration very difficult, and when muscle cramps set in, spasmodic spasmodic contraction of the arms probably became impossible. Respiratory assistance from leg extension would also have been progressively more difficult, and eventually respiration was purely diaphragmatic and asphyxiation inevitable. Severe lack of tissue, organ, or oxygen in turn causes so-called Moon's vicious cycle, characterized by dilation and increased permeability of capillaries, congestion of dependent body parts, loss of blood and serum from the vascular system, drop in blood pressure, and further tissue anoxemia due to hypovolemia. Hy- Hypovolemic shock is inevitable or inevitably causes failure of vital organs like the kidneys, brain, and heart. Abolish muscular activity in the legs, slows venous return to the heart, and punctuates venous leg thrombosis. As mentioned above, anomaxium may also precipitate vasovagal cardiac arrest. Schluck reports on experiments by Mulder in which healthy medical students volunteers agreed to being hung by the wrist with continuous respiratory and cardiovascular monitoring. After only 6 minutes, the tidal respiratory volumes of volunteers had decreased by approximately 70%. Blood pressure had dropped by almost 50%, and pulse rates had doubled. Evidence of serious cardiorespiratory decomposition set in, and at 12 minutes, respiration was purely diaphragmatic, and there was evidence of disturbed consciousness. When the volunteers were allowed to support their weight intermittently on their feet for 20 seconds at a time, the cardiovascular collapse improved significantly. The experiment could only be continued for 30 to 40 minutes. When pain in the wrist necessitated or discontinuation, the potentially beneficial effects of footrest, or by implication, seat rest settles in maintaining cardiovascular viability, was therefore demonstrated. It has indeed been suggested that these aids were introduced with the specific aim of prolonging suffering on the cross. Breaking the tibias, possibly fibulas, of the lower legs, phrygium, was known to cause rapid death. Breaking of the bones was indeed also used in antiquity as a primary mode of execution outside crucifixion. Death probably resulted from pain-induced vasculocardiac arrest in a person with a severely compromised vascular system. Fat embolization from the tibia fractures could have been a contributory cause of death. Significant hemorrhage is unlikely to have ensued. A fracture of the tibia would also have abolished leg extension as an aid to respiration. But one wonders whether this would still have been relevant at the very late stages of crucifixion, when crucifixion was normally performed. A sharp club blow in the to the chest almost certainly caused death by reflex cardiac arrest, and most writers assume that the spear thrust to the upper abdomen or chest was aimed at perforation of the heart, probably the right atrium or ventricle, immediately behind the sternum. Conclusion: the condemned on the cross dying a slow death a day or longer would therefore have died predominantly of multi-organ failure caused by circulatory collapse due to hypovolemic shock, decreased blood volume. Hypovolemia would have resulted from traumatic blood loss and dehydration, but perhaps mainly from asphyxial anoxemia, respiratory failure, causing severe capillary dilatation and damage, with orthostatic congestion and exudation of serum and blood into the tissues. Sudden death, whether superimposed or hypovolemic shock or not, would most probably have resulted from reflex vasovagal heart arrest, a cause mainly by severe pain, but perhaps on occasion from puncturing of the pleura by a fractured rib caused by scourging. Other causes of acute death could have included a pulmonary embolus from venous thrombi in the embolized legs, or very rarely coronary artery embolization and myocardial death from aspetic thrombi formed on the heart valve, known to occur in severely traumatized persons, and even pneumothorax or acute um, pneumothorax from a lung punctured by the sharp edge of a fractured rib. Severe and prolonged anoxemia may also have caused pericardial infusions and theoretically have precipitated cardiac arrest. Mm-mm-mm. We have stavros or stavro, word forming element from Greek, used in science and theology and meaning cross. From Greek stavros, pole, cross, which is cognate with Old Norse stor, pole. From pi, steropol, sea, steer. The Greek word also formed words for the crucifixion, e.g., staurosis, impalement, crucifixion. And the importance of this is similar to the word God, where it came from Proto-Germanic, Indo-European. Most people don't know this. They see God as the one and only deity, but in old pre or Proto-Germanic, it didn't mean a deity like that. It meant to invoke or to call. So it has nothing to do with El or Yahweh or anything like that. The word was completely separate. Now, Theos, that goes into another Greek, their language, the Indo-European, the Greek side of that. The same thing with Latin. Dios, Dios, El, God, they're not the same. It's all different. But most people that don't know etymology doesn't, they don't know this stuff. But here we go. This is the with cross storos. They derived from the base of the Greek verb hestemi, meaning to stand or to set up. There is no direct Hebrew equivalent for storos, as crucifixion was a Roman practice. However, the concept of a sacrificial offering can be linked to Hebrew terms like misbech, altar, and korban, offering. In the New Testament, storos primarily refers to the cross, an instrument of execution used by the Romans. It is most notably associated with the crucifixion of Yeshua HaMashiach. The term can also metaphorically represent the suffering, sacrifice, discipleship required of believers, as seen in passages where Yeshua calls his followers to take up their cross, or storos. Which is interesting because if that word didn't exist, what was he saying? So he would have had to be fluent in Greek, stavros. Cultural and historical background. The stavros was a common method of execution in the Roman Empire, reserved for the most severe criminals and slaves. I say again, reserved for the most severe criminals and slaves. It was a symbol of shame and suffering. However, in Christian theology, The cross transformed into a symbol of salvation, redemption, and the ultimate expression of El's love, or Jesus, Yeshua's love, through the sacrificial death of Yeshua HaMashiach. The early Christians redefined the cross from a symbol of disgrace to one of victory and hope. So they changed history, all to make everything better from what happened to Yeshua to turn it into something good. All right, this is Robin Jensen, theology, University of, I believe, Notre Dame, right? University of Notre Dame. She has an interesting book that I found. I don't currently have access to it, but I will be getting access to this book. It's this one, The Cross, History, Art, and Controversy, Cambridge and May, Harvard University Press, 2017. Let me see. There we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, this book seems interesting. I've only can read portions of it that's available on Google Books. But I'm gonna be able to get this book somewhere or another. Um, yeah, for sure, because I don't have access to it. All right, this is the book cover to it. Let me see. There we go. The cross. I like how they copyrighted the cross history. That's too funny. But I did see an interesting passage um, in the first chapter I wanted to read in the Scandalium Crucis, the curse of the cross. They proclaimed our madness to consist in the fact that we give to a crucified man a place second to the unchangeable and eternal Dios, or Creol, or Theos, the creator of all, for they do not discern the mystery that is herein, to which, as we make it plain to you, we pray you to give heed. Justin Martyr. At the heart of the story of the Christian cross is the narrative of Christ's crucifixion. For Christians, the cross's meaning is embedded in this narrative and testifies to it. Thus, the cross's tale begins with the event of Christ's crucifixion, as it was both reported and interpreted by the earliest textual and material sources. These witnesses reveal that adherents to the Jesus movement had to wrestle with the nearly incomprehensible fact that the Savior and Son of God died in an ignominious and excruciating way. The earliest written accounts show that his followers were initially confused and frightened, even though they were soon reassured by the empty tomb and Christ's reappearance on the road or in an upper room. However, even believing in Jesus' resurrection did not erase their need to understand why God would have let the beloved Son suffer such a death. With insight, they converted an ostensible stumbling block into a symbol of divine love and defeat of evil. In so doing, they also transformed the figure of the cross from a badge of dishonor into sign of victory. One of the best examples of this appears in a very early Christian document, St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, in which the author inserted an ancient summary of belief about Christ. It declares that Jesus, though in the form of God, humbled himself and became obedient unto death, adding the phrase, even death upon a cross. De natura de satura. Philippians chapter 2, verse 8. By including this specific reference to the form of his death, the writer recognizes that Jesus' crucifixion had to have been troubling, while asserting that it was both purposeful and momentous. The next line explains, therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. I want to read this again. Therefore, God, the word's not God there. What is the word? The word's theos. These words have different meanings, right? Has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that all creation should bow before him and confess that he is Lord. The same thing with the word Lord, and that's Philippians chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. But that's the same thing with the word Lord. Most people think it's just the title, but no, it actually had a purpose and meaning. In the Hebrew, in the Tanakh, it was Yahuwah or Yahweh. But when you look at the etymology of the word Lord, it's the same thing where it comes from Old English, halfor, which means loaf of bread or keeper of the loaf of bread, guard of the loaf of bread, loaf ward. All these words are Indo-European. For those that don't know this, and you're religious, I highly recommend you actually finding out where these words in the Bible comes from. That's my recommendation. Thus, from earliest times, Jesus' death unquestionably was perceived as a paradoxical juxtaposition of degradation, and elevation. It was at once the most intense expression of his obedience and humility, and the clearest indication of God's approval and his glorious identity. Through the centuries, artists have illustrated this glorification by showing the elevation of the cross itself, borne up to heaven by angels, while still accompanied with the instruments of his passion. Saints, prophets, patriarchs, and angels alike gaze up in awe. Post-New Testament documents show that Christ's death on the cross continued to pose problems for early Christian ministries, who undertook both to explain and to defend it as part of the divine plan and not a simple accident of history. Their case for the defense required creative heretical strategies aimed at the objections of their opponents by perhaps also at assuaging their own doubts. Crucifixion was an intentionally brutal and humiliating form of capital punishment, meted out to thieves, rebellious slaves, leaders of insurrection, and army deserters. Jews awaiting a kingly Messiah saw death by crucifixion as cursed and contradictory to their expectations. Pagans could not fathom a crucified God. I'm going to read that again. Pagans could not fathom a crucified God. The former found it incomprehensible. The latter ludicrous. They could not accept that a Masonic savior or someone the gods favored would undergo such humiliation. It was contrary to logic and scandalous to entertain. Thus, certain early Christian groups revised the story to remove the troubling elements and to allow Jesus to escape death altogether. So the concept of the crucifixion was embarrassing for the pagans or the barbarians or all these other Germanic tribes and um, Old English, those tribes up there in Britain. It was so embarrassing that the Masonic savior, the gods, the Son of God, died such a crucial death that they re-envisioned the story. They revised the story and to remove that troubling elements of the crucifixion altogether. Wow. How many people has told you that? Like, is this the first time you've ever heard this? I've never, when I read this, I'm like, I had no idea. I did not know that happened in European history. No idea. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. Those who maintain the narrative of suffering acknowledged the cross's confounding nature, yet then sought to demonstrate its pro, um, providential providential purpose. Further, they attempted to show that the cross was not only foreshadowed in sacred texts, but also perceived everywhere in the external, secular world, once recognized as universally evident in both scripture and nature. Its power and promise could not be gainsaid. Instead of a mere instrument employed by, and that's where it cuts off. So I definitely am interested and intrigued um, by what she's saying, the author saying, Robin Jensen. Definitely intrigued for sure. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna get this book. I got my ways. I'm gonna get the book. So if you're interested, might send it your way once I get it and whatnot. So yeah, just write a comment. Let me know if you're interested after I get the book. But I'll definitely get a PDF version. Yeah. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe if you're not a subscribed follower of my channel. I put some effort into these videos, and you're gonna get some wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know what you like, didn't like, what I can improve. I appreciate it. Thank you. Biblical Day in there out.